The Blue Moon Diner, Manhattan. Rain hammered against the windows as David Sterling, billionaire CEO of Sterling Tech, watched the woman in the worn waitress uniform pouring his coffee. Sarah Mitchell, single mother, working double shifts to keep her daughter Emma fed. He didn't know she'd been watching him for weeks, memorizing his loneliness. He didn't know about his ex-wife's hitman waiting outside, but when he grabbed her hand and whispered, "Please, pretend to love me for 10 minutes, or I'm dead," Sarah did something that shocked everyone. She didn't pretend. She kissed that stranger like her life depended on it, because she recognized in his eyes the same terror she'd felt when her husband died. And those 10 minutes changed two broken lives forever. The Blue Moon Diner on the corner of 42nd and Lexington was the kind of place where New York showed both its faces, the gleaming skyscrapers visible through rain-streaked windows, while inside, cracked vinyl booths held construction workers and CEOs alike, all seeking the same comfort in bitter coffee and pie that had seen better days. Sarah Mitchell had started her shift at 5 that morning, after getting Emma ready for school in their cramped Brooklyn apartment, where the radiator clanged like a ghost in chains, and the hot water worked when it felt like it. Her feet already ached in the orthopedic shoes she'd bought secondhand, the ones that were supposed to help with 12-hour shifts, but mostly just redistributed the pain. The photograph of Emma tucked behind the order pad showed a 7-year-old with her mother's green eyes and her late father's stubborn chin. The girl was probably at after-school care now, the cheap one at the community center where they let kids do homework until 6 and didn't ask too many questions when parents were late with payment. David Sterling had been coming to the diner every Tuesday night for 2 months. Sarah had noticed him from the first night, not because she recognized him as the CEO of Sterling Tech, though half of Manhattan knew his face from magazine covers and charity galas, but because of the way he occupied space like an apology. This man, who owned half of Silicon Alley, sat in the corner booth like he was trying to disappear into the cracked leather. Always the same ritual: black coffee that he nursed for exactly 90 minutes. Apple pie he pushed around the plate but never ate. Laptop open to spreadsheets that meant billions but brought no light to his gray eyes. He tipped exactly 40%, never made eye contact, and left like a ghost at 8:30 sharp. But that night, Sarah noticed something different in his behavior. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he pretended to focus on his screen. The way his body tensed every time the bell above the door chimed, his eyes darting to the entrance every 30 seconds with mechanical precision, like a prey animal checking for predators. Sarah had learned to read people in her 29 years of survival. When you grow up in foster care, marry young to escape, then watch your husband die in Afghanistan while you're 3 months pregnant, you either learn to read danger or you don't survive. And David Sterling, despite his $3,000 suit and Rolex that cost more than her yearly rent, was radiating the kind of fear she knew intimately. She was approaching his table with the coffee pot, muscle memory guiding her movements after thousands of refills, when the diner door burst open with unnecessary force. The woman who entered looked like she'd stepped out of a Vogue photo shoot, 5'10" in heels that could kill, wrapped in a coat that probably cost more than the diner made in a month. Victoria Sterling, David's ex-wife, heir to a pharmaceutical empire, with a reputation for destroying anything that didn't bend to her will. Sarah knew the story. Everyone in New York knew it. The divorce had been front-page news for months. Him, the self-made tech genius who'd built an empire from nothing. Her, the aristocrat who'd married him when he was still nobody, then tried to destroy him when he became somebody. The tabloids had whispered about affairs, about violence behind closed doors, about threats that money kept quiet. Victoria slid into the booth across from David. The smile she gave him was the kind predators wore before the kill. Sarah saw terror explode in David's eyes like silent fireworks. It was the same terror she'd seen in the mirror the day the military officers came to her door with their rehearsed condolences and a folded flag. She was setting down his coffee when it happened. David grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, pulled her close with the desperation of a drowning man grabbing driftwood. The words came out in a whisper only Sarah could hear, urgent as a cardiac arrest. Another person would have hesitated, would have calculated risks, demanded explanations, considered consequences. Not Sarah, because in that moment, she didn't see a billionaire CEO, but Mike asking for help he couldn't voice before that last deployment. She saw every woman in the diner who'd smiled through bruises. She saw Emma in 20 years if the world didn't change, if women like Victoria kept existing with impunity. The kiss that followed scandalized the Blue Moon Diner to its 1950s foundations. Sarah set the coffee pot on the counter with studied calm, then bent down and kissed David like a woman who'd loved him for decades. It wasn't a timid or hesitant kiss. It was pure passion, the kind they used to show in old Hollywood movies before the censors got involved. Sarah's hand went to the back of his neck, fingers threading through hair that probably got $100 cuts. Her other hand caressed his face with a tenderness that made half the diner hold its breath. The entire restaurant stopped breathing. Conversations cut off mid-sentence, forks suspended in mid-air. Even the short-order cook forgot about the burger burning on the grill, letting it smoke in protest. When they separated, after what felt simultaneously like seconds and geological eras, Sarah sat down next to David with the naturalness of someone who'd been doing it for years. She took his hand, interlacing their fingers with a familiarity that fooled even the regulars who saw him there every week, always alone, always untouchable. Victoria stared at them, with her jaw clenched so tight you could hear teeth grinding. Her perfectly Botoxed face had turned an unhealthy red, the veins in her neck pulsing like snakes under skin. Sarah turned to her with a smile that was pure challenge, distilled into sweetness. She said nothing, but the message was clear. This man is mine. Leave. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached into her purse, and for a moment Sarah tensed, ready for anything. A gun, a knife, the kind of violence that money usually hired others to do. Instead, Victoria pulled out her phone, typed something quickly, and stormed out, her heels clicking on the linoleum like gunshots. Through the window, Sarah saw her get into a black town car that had been idling outside. In the passenger seat, barely visible through the tinted glass, sat a man who looked like he broke bones for a living. The diner slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. The cook scraped the charred burger into the trash. But David and Sarah remained frozen in their tableau, hands still clasped, both trembling for different reasons. David looked at her like he was seeing a miracle or a particularly vivid hallucination. His expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the fierce sweat, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes that made him look younger than his 41 years. When he tried to speak, Sarah shook her head slightly. Not yet. Victoria might still be watching. They sat there for 10 more minutes, playing the part of lovers while the rain turned the windows into waterfalls, and New York rushed by outside, oblivious to the drama in the fluorescent-lit diner. Sarah could feel David's pulse through his wrist, rapid as a hummingbird's wings. Her own heart was racing, but not from fear, from something else, something she hadn't felt since Mike shipped out for the last time. Finally, when she was sure Victoria was gone, Sarah started to pull her hand away. David held on, not forcefully, but with a desperation that made her pause. He looked at her with those gray eyes that probably closed million-dollar deals without blinking, but now looked lost, as a child's. The story came out in whispers between coffee refills and customers. Victoria wanted him dead. Not divorced, not bankrupt, dead. She'd hired someone, David had proof, but no one who'd listen. The police were in her family's pocket. The FBI thought he was paranoid, and his security team had been mysteriously reassigned. He'd He'd been coming to this diner, this unfashionable little diner, because it was the last place she'd look for him. Sarah listened while automatically serving other customers, her muscle memory handling orders while her mind processed this impossible situation. A billionaire hiding in a diner from his killer ex-wife. It sounded like a bad movie plot, except the fear in David's eyes was real as the coffee stains on her apron. When her shift ended at 11, 6 hours later than their staged romance, David was still there. He'd ordered dinner he didn't eat, dessert he didn't touch, anything to stay in the safety of the diner's fluorescent embrace. Sarah sat down across from him, finally able to really look at him without the performance. He was handsome in that exhausted way successful men often were, like they'd traded their youth for stock options. His suit was perfectly tailored but wrinkled from too many hours worn. His hands, which she'd held for show, had calluses that suggested he still coded despite running a billion-dollar company. And his eyes, those gray eyes that had begged for help, held a loneliness that all his money couldn't cure. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone who didn't understand what desperation looked like, what it meant to have no options except the crazy ones. She told David about Emma, about the eviction notice, about the medical bills from Emma's asthma that insurance wouldn't cover. Then she made him an offer. She'd be his bodyguard and girlfriend rolled into one. She'd keep Victoria at bay with their performance. In exchange, he'd pay her enough to save her daughter's future. David looked at her like she'd offered him water in the desert. The negotiation was brief. He offered too much money. She demanded health insurance instead. They settled on both, plus a college fund for Emma. They shook hands across the table, sealing the strangest contract in the history of fake relationships. Two broken people pretending to be whole, hoping the performance would last long enough to save them both. The next day, Sarah found herself in David's office on the 60th floor of Sterling Tower. The elevator ride up had shown her a New York she'd only seen from the ground. The city shrinking below until people looked like ants, and problems seemed solvable. The office itself was bigger than her entire apartment building, all glass and steel and views that probably cost $1 million per window. David waited by the window wall, Manhattan spread below him like a conquered kingdom. The contrast with the terrified man from the diner was complete. Here, in his element, he looked like the magazines portrayed him. Powerful, untouchable, alone. The contract they signed was unusual even by New York standards. Not for money, though the amount made Sarah's hands shake, but for performance. She would play his girlfriend for 6 months, while his lawyers built a case against Victoria. In return, besides the money, Emma would get into Manhattan's best private school. They'd get a real apartment in a building with working heat, and Sarah would get to stop worrying about choosing between groceries and medicine. But there was something else in the contract, something neither of them had asked for, but both understood. They would protect each other. From Victoria, from poverty, from the loneliness that ate at both of them like cancer. Emma met David at Central Park, neutral territory where a billionaire and a waitress's daughter could just be two people feeding ducks. Sarah had dressed Emma in her best clothes, hand-me-downs from the thrift store, but clean and carefully mended. David arrived in jeans and a Yankees cap.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Trying so hard to look normal that it was almost painful. Emma studied him with the intensity of a 7-year-old who'd learned early that adults couldn't always be trusted. She accepted the expensive hot chocolate he'd bought, looked at the FAO Schwartz bag he'd brought with barely concealed longing, then asked the question that froze both adults. Are you going to be another daddy who leaves? The innocence of the question hit David like a physical blow. Sarah saw him flinch, saw something crack in his carefully constructed facade. He knelt down to Emma's level, designer jeans getting dirty on the park path, and gave her the only answer that mattered. I don't know, but I promise I'll try not to. Emma nodded, satisfied with his honesty in a way she never would have been with false promises. She took his hand to show him her favorite spot by the pond, and Sarah saw David's face transform with something that looked dangerously like hope. David turned out to be as lonely as Sarah had suspected. For all his billions, his evenings were spent alone in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home. He didn't know how to cook. Sarah taught him to make spaghetti, while Emma did homework at his massive dining table. He didn't know how to play. Emma taught him video games on the enormous TV he'd never turned on. The fake relationship became harder to maintain as real affection crept in. David would absent-mindedly tuck Sarah's hair behind her ear during board meetings. Sarah would straighten his tie without thinking. Emma started calling him Mr. David, with a tone that suggested she was testing out something more. One night, while working late at his office, David debugging code while Sarah studied for the online degree he'd insisted on paying for, something shifted. She found him crying silently at his desk, looking at code comments that were all dated from his marriage to Victoria, each one a little timestamp of hope before it all went wrong. Sarah kissed him then, not for show, not for contracts, but because two lonely people recognized each other in the dark. They pulled apart, terrified of what it meant, of how it complicated everything, of how much it could hurt when it ended. Victoria escalated from threats to action. She had Emma's school called with false abuse allegations. She had Sarah's apartment vandalized. She made it clear, surrender David, or lose everything. The confrontation came at a charity gala at the Met. Victoria arrived with her father, the pharmaceutical king who owned judges like playing cards. She cornered David and Sarah, smiled for the cameras, and whispered that she had men waiting outside Emma's babysitter's apartment. David did something then that shocked everyone, including Sarah. He pulled out his phone and live-streamed to his company's 1 million followers. He confessed everything: the abuse during their marriage, the death threats, the hired killers. He named names, showed receipts, destroyed his own reputation to take down Victoria's family empire. The stream went viral in minutes. The FBI, faced with public pressure, had to act. Victoria was arrested on the museum steps, her father's empire crumbling in real time as stocks plummeted and investigations launched. In the chaos, as police and reporters swarmed, David found Sarah in the museum's Egyptian wing. Emma was safe. His security team had grabbed her the moment the stream started. They stood among artifacts of dead civilizations, two people who'd started with a lie and found truth. The trial of Victoria Sterling became New York's scandal of the decade. The untouchable pharmaceutical heiress in handcuffs, photographed entering court with the look of someone who couldn't understand how the world had dared to rebel. Testimonies piled up like avalanches. Other men she'd terrorized, investigators she'd bribed, a trail of violence hidden behind charity galas and museum wings with her name on them. The 20-year sentence was met with applause in the courtroom. Her father's empire collapsed within weeks, investigations revealing decades of price-fixing, bribery, and worse. The castle of privilege built over generations crumbled in months of hearings. A year later, the Blue Moon Diner looked exactly the same. Cracked vinyl booths, flickering neon, coffee that could strip paint. But the atmosphere was completely different. Not a temple to desperation and survival, but a place where an impossible family had found its rhythm. David sat in the same corner booth where it all began, wearing a t-shirt and jeans that actually fit his new life. He'd stepped down as CEO, keeping only the CTO role that let him code. His first love, the thing Victoria had mocked him for. The billions were still there, but they lived simply, in a brownstone in Brooklyn, where the neighbors knew them as the family, with the little girl who talked too much, and the parents who couldn't keep their hands off each other. Sarah sat across from him, no longer in a waitress uniform, but in scrubs. She was in her second year of nursing school, David's insistence on education having awakened dreams she'd buried with Mike. She still worked at the diner one shift a week, Partly for the memories, mostly because she never wanted to forget where she came from. Emma, now 8 and missing her front teeth, was teaching David how to make origami cranes with napkins. Her private school uniform was stained with chocolate milk, her backpack held together with duct tape because she refused to let David buy her a new one until this one completely died. She'd inherited her mother's practicality and her late father's stubbornness, but she'd learned something neither parent had taught her: how to trust in happiness. The moment came without warning, as life-changing moments do. Sarah looked up from her anatomy textbook and caught David watching her with an expression that still, after a year, made her stomach flip. He said those 2 words they'd been dancing around, terrified that speaking them would break the spell. The conversation that followed was a dance of half-truths and veiled admissions, the shyness damaged adults have when admitting they've found happiness. David confessed he'd loved her from that first kiss, the one that was supposed to be fake, but never was. Sarah admitted she'd been watching him for weeks before that night, drawn to his loneliness, like recognizing a fellow survivor. Emma, with the comic timing of children, interrupted to announce that all this romance was giving her cavities. But then she got up and hugged them both, her skinny arms trying to encompass 2 adults and the baby Sarah was carrying but hadn't told anyone about yet. The epilogue unfolded over the next 5 years like a quilt stitched from ordinary miracles. Sterling Tech went public at a $3 billion valuation, but David stayed in his coding cave, leaving the CEO role to someone who actually wanted it. His story, from foster care to billions to finding love in a diner, became Silicon Valley legend. But he kept his old Sterling Tech janitor badge in his wallet, a reminder that humility is the price of wisdom. Emma, now 13, had been accepted to Stuyvesant on merit, not money. She'd inherited her mother's sharp green eyes and her father's. She'd started calling David Dad, so gradually no one remembered when it began. Gift for mathematics. She volunteered at the community center where she'd once done homework, teaching younger kids that being poor didn't mean being powerless. Thomas, 5 years old, was a hurricane of energy with David's gray eyes and Sarah's determination. He terrorized his kindergarten with experiments involving food coloring and controlled explosions. His teachers adored and feared him equally, seeing either future genius or criminal mastermind. During an interview with The Times, the reporter asked Sarah what the secret to their success was. The answer went viral, translated into 30 languages, printed on merchandise, quoted in business schools worldwide. Sarah looked at David, who was teaching Thomas how to code a simple game, while Emma live-streamed it to her 50,000 followers who loved her "My Adorable Nerdy Family" content. Sarah's answer was simple and devastating. She'd learned that pretending to be strong when you're weak actually makes you strong, that asking a stranger for help can save your life, that love doesn't start perfect, but builds, lie by lie, until it becomes the most solid truth you know. The Blue Moon Diner, riding the wave of their story becoming urban legend, put a brass plaque on the corner booth. Where love forgot, it was pretending. Tourists lined up for photos. Couples reserved it months in advance for proposals. Revenue tripled. But the real magic happened every anniversary of that rainy November night. Sarah would put on her old waitress uniform, held together more by memory than thread, and serve David coffee. He'd look at her with mock terror and whisper, "Pretend to love me for 10 minutes." And she'd answer, different each time but always meaning the same thing, that she'd forgotten how to pretend. The kiss that followed still scandalized the diner, but now customers applauded. Emma pretended disgust while filming everything. Thomas, who didn't fully understand the story but knew it was important, clapped with hands covered in whatever he'd been eating. One evening, while putting Thomas to bed, he demanded the story of how they met for the 100th time, though they kept it PG. David told Sarah something he'd never said before. That night, when he'd kissed her the first time, for a moment he'd felt Mike there. Not literally, but spiritually. Like Mike had guided him to that diner, to that moment, to save the family he'd left behind. Sarah cried, but they were good tears, the kind that clean instead of stain. She confessed that she'd felt it too, something supernatural in that kiss, like the universe had conspired to bring them together, two broken pieces that formed something whole. The story of the billionaire and the waitress became a case study in psychology programs. How can love born from fear and lies become so solid? Professors wrote papers. Students wrote theses. The answers were multiple, and none completely satisfying. But Emma, with the wisdom of her 13 years, had the best theory. True love, she told anyone who asked, wasn't what started perfect. It was what started as a desperate lie whispered to a stranger and became the most important truth of your life. It was David who gave away his CEO title to write code. It was Mom who went from serving coffee to saving lives. It was Thomas who broke everything he touched, but then hugged you with sticky hands and the world made sense again. The last image of this story was a photo Emma posted on Instagram on her 16th birthday. The caption simply read, "My family started with a lie and continues with truth." In the photo, David with coffee stains on his expensive shirt from teaching Thomas about gravity, Sarah in scrubs with her RN badge gleaming, Thomas with his face covered in birthday cake, and her, Emma, in the center, holding them all together as she always had, since she was 7, and understood that sometimes families aren't born, but found. In the background, through the window, you could see the Blue Moon Diner glowing in the New York night, and on a napkin, barely visible, a perfect origami crane that David had finally learned to make. The love that was born from 10 minutes of pretending had become a lifetime of truth. And it continued. If this story touched your heart, if you held your breath during the twists, if you believed that love can bloom even from desperation, leave a like to support stories that show how real life surpasses any fiction. Comment with the moment that moved you most. Share with those who need to believe that love always finds its way. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that will keep you hooked until the last word. Remember, sometimes the greatest truths are born from the most desperate lies, and the love you pretend can become the love that saves. Have you ever pretended something that became real? Tell us in the comments.